We are Military Analytics. The damage done by war to soldiers and military equipment cannot be underestimated. As a result of the numerous wars that have continued from antiquity to the present, we have witnessed the wear and tear of the armies. Today we witness how the supply problems in the army affect the soldiers in the relentless war between Russia and Ukraine. Let's talk about the problems in the Russian army in detail. As is known, the Ukraine war is in its 14th month. Great losses on the battlefield and stress disorders related to the prolonged war bring riots. Depending on the riots, their escape from the Russian army accelerates. Finally, according to a speech deciphered by the Ukrainian intelligence unit, we learned that a detachment of soldiers from the 20th Guards Combined Army was completely destroyed and is trying to return to Russia with survivors. According to the intercepted conversation, a soldier from the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army tells one of his comrades that he is returning to Russia with the survivors of his detachment. The soldier emphasizes that he will return to Russia via Donetsk and that the Russian army no longer has any dominance in the region. His friend, speaking on the other side, emphasizes that he should hide in a basement. However, the soldier explains that the region has come under Ukrainian domination, that they will not be able to find them, and that they will try to get rid of them by their own means. While the Ukrainian army was advancing, the soldier who said that the Russian command left the battlefield before them cites the cowardly commanders as responsible for the losses. The common thought of the rebelling soldiers is the irregular operation of the chain of command in the army. Let's get to know the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army, which fled the front lines. The 20th Guard United Arms Army is a field army. This army was initially designated as the 4th Tank Army of the Soviet Land Forces. The 4th Guards Tank Army in 1945, the 4th Guards Mechanized Army in 1946, and the 20th Guards Army in 1960. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the army became part of the Russian ground forces. This army, which was a part of the Russian ground forces, came to the fore when it left the front lines. However, their escape from the front was not the first one among Russian troops. As we know, the Russian army lost 130 tanks and hundreds of soldiers in its attack on the Donetsk region. The tanks that could remain intact could not be withdrawn from the destroyed bridges and roads and fell into the hands of the Ukrainian troops. As a result, the platoon's command level stated that further progress was meaningless and stopped the operation, and their escape from the Russian army continued increasingly in the ongoing process. For example, in the past months, military training camps in Belarus were boiling like a witch's cauldron with the desertions and rebellions of Russian soldiers. While Vladimir Putin was sweating in Belarus to renew his military power, the dissatisfied Russian soldiers stood on the brink of revolt. The news that armed Russian soldiers training in Belarus escaped from a military camp fell like a bombshell. Before being released, Putin's troops were required to train on the ground of the state, which was a long-time Moscow ally. However, Russian men who do not want to risk their lives for Putin's Ukraine dream seek salvation in rebellion and desertion. Belarus had set up various barricades and checkpoints to find the fugitive armed soldiers in the Minsk region. It was announced that a group of men up to 40 years old in military uniform were sought. Russian leader Vladimir Putin passed the new law in the Russian parliament to prevent the despondent troops from leaving their posts in Ukraine due to the escapes on the front lines. As Russia continues to face heavy losses of troops, weapons, and territory in Ukraine, the country's parliament has passed new legislation designed to prevent more soldiers from leaving their posts in battlefield. The new law introduces stricter rules for soldiers and tougher penalties for those who surrender or leave the battlefield in Ukraine. According to the new law, leaving office during mobilization, martial law, or war will be considered an aggravating factor and will result in more severe penalties. According to the new law, the penalties will be as follows. Soldiers face up to 10 years in prison for voluntarily surrendering and up to 15 years for looting. The new articles introduced into existing law mean that these crimes are more likely to result in maximum prison sentences when committed during martial law, mobilization, or war. According to the articles, conscientious objectors who refuse to fight when necessary can be imprisoned for up to 3 years during the war. While the losses in the Russian army and the escape from the army continue, Putin, who is looking for a way out of the current situation, is preparing to declare a general mobilization with new prohibitions and laws. The Russian army is retreating about 482 kilometers from the places it occupied. This retreat adds to the disintegration of the army. The news of the unsuccessful operation and withdrawal from the Kharkiv region increases the courage of the soldiers to not fight as the Putin administration prepares for the new general mobilization announcement. Inmates in prisons and the homeless living on the streets of Russia continue to be sources for Wagner's potential military needs. So what do we know about this Wagner Group? Let's quickly review what we know. Failures on the battlefield and Ukraine's strategic attacks on the Crimean Bridge and the Black Sea Fleet prompted Russian President Vladimir Putin to continually reorganize his chain of command. These changes had little effect on the battlefield, and this was when Prigozhin's Wagner Group began to act in line with its own goals. It's a mercenary group operating in the Middle East, Africa, and even South America. There are about 50,000 Wagner Group mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. Most of the fighters are convicts conscripted from prisons and penal colonies with the promise of freedom if they complete a 6-month tenure in Ukraine. But about 1 in 5 Wagner Group mercenaries is a seasoned contractor, usually with prior military experience. At the beginning of the war, the role of the private military company in the Russian operation was quite limited. But when the Russian army began to falter after several defeats on the entire battlefield, Russian President Vladimir Putin turned to his close friend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader and supporter of the Wagner Group. The influence and role of the private military company in the Russian operation gradually increased. The Wagner Group reached the zenith of its influence in the fight for the town of Bakhmut in Donbass. For the first time in a large-scale operation, the Kremlin turned to mercenaries to take the town, leaving the Russian army in a supporting role. Since then, the Wagner Group has led the struggle in the region, achieving some minor victories, such as the capture of the small town of Soledar, north of Bakhmut, but at the cost of horrific losses. However, the Wagner Group star may soon fade as the increasingly alarmed Russian military tries to reassert its authority over the planning and conduct of war. In addition, the Russian administration does not give up trying to win alternative ways in this war, which it understands that it will lose. According to the information obtained from Ukrainian official Andriy Yermak, officials appointed by the Russians in many occupied regions tried to turn the war in their favor by holding a referendum to join Russia, according to the reports in the Russian press. These referendums aimed to protect the people of the region from Russian operations. However, Yermak interpreted this situation as an alternative solution to Putin's fear of losing the war. Departures from the Russian army continue. Putin's attitude towards his citizens and soldiers is getting tougher. Ukraine is shifting from defensive to attacking. It seems that this war, which was the beginning of the end for Russia, is about to come to an end. While withdrawing, provide Russia with the recovery desires. The heavy defeats of the Russian forces in the Volodar Bakhmut and Kremenosvodov regions. Ammunition losses caused the most elite Russian divisions to flee, surrender or refuse to fight. Almost all of the Russian Navy elite 155th Marine Brigade was destroyed in the battles of Kherson and Volodar. In addition, the entire 1st Tank Army of the Russian Federation was heavily defeated in the Battle of Kharkiv, and only 30% of all the army's divisions survived. Now we see that 3 more Russian divisions are faced with a similar situation in Luhansk. Let's take a closer look at how the Russian divisions were wiped out from the Donbass region as divine justice. We strive to bring you the most striking news, collective and accurate information from the front by working hard day and night with our expert staff as quickly as possible. You can support us by subscribing to our channel. In recent days, the Russians' problems in terms of military ammunition as a result of the resistance of the Ukrainian forces were also reflected in the momentary situation on the front lines. Turning the situation into an advantage, the Ukrainian armed forces increased their pressure, especially in the Luhansk region. The 92nd Ivan Serko Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army destroyed the Russian Army's ammunition depot in the direction of Svanov, one of the most critical front lines of the Luhansk region. The video of this striking attack was viewed by millions of users on social media. In the images of this offensive operation organized by the Ukrainian forces, the Russian arsenal, which was engulfed in flames as a result of the successful artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, gradually burned to ashes. It was also claimed that after this incident, a Russian division in Studhof fled the region. Those who could not escape were reported to have surrendered to the Ukrainian forces. A Russian commander who made striking statements on the subject attracted a lot of attention. The commander of a Russian Bars 13 claimed that Russian operations in the Luhansk and Kharkiv provinces had been misjudged. In his view, determining the information conditions for the potential peak of the Russian offensive in this part of the front line was probably of limited scope. According to the Russian commander, Ukraine's significant expansion of its offensive area and continued active operations with reconnaissance and detection groups heralded the sad end. Such local offensive operations by Russian forces to regain lost positions and drive Ukrainian forces away from the Russian-occupied Svatov and Belgorod Oblast did not turn out as expected. For this reason, almost all of the 144th and 3rd Motor Rifle Divisions of the 20th Combined Arms Army in the Western Military District of the Russian forces, as well as the 98th, 76th, and 106th Russian Air Forces, could not find a way out along the Svatov-Kremenna line. For this reason, these Russian forces in Luhansk were neutralized as a result of the Ukrainian attacks, and some of them were claimed to have surrendered to the Ukrainian army. The attachment of the equivalent of 3 Russian divisions to a separate geographical area showed that the Russian forces aimed to prioritize this axis of advance and to make significant gains in this area. However, these 3 Russian divisions, which were faced with the crossfire power of the artillery attacks of the Ukrainians along the Svatov and Kremenna, were excluded from the war, having lost such a great military power. The Russian troops began to withdraw slowly from Luhansk, where clashes took place. Already, the decisive offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces, which continued in Luhansk Oblast, had for some time brought the tensions on the front lines in this region to a peak. Withdrawing from this critical terrain in Luhansk, the Russians realized that offensive operations could not be called a full-fledged attack. In addition, the successful offensives achieved by the Ukrainian forces in the positions near Kremenna were one of the biggest proofs that the Ukrainian defense in the region had turned into an offensive. If you remember, the Ukrainian forces first created a steel defensive shield in Kremenna. The Ukrainian soldiers who managed to repel the Russian attacks on this front line for a certain period of time then went to the counterattack position and started to hunt the tired Russian soldiers in Kremenna. When we look at the current situation in Kremenna, we see that this time the Russians took the defensive position and the Ukrainians carried out offensives. Russia's war with Ukraine has undoubtedly inflicted unimaginable human costs with hundreds of thousands of casualties. But economically and geopolitically, the effects of Vladimir Putin's decision spread far and wide. Russia primarily occupied Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and the country's second-largest city, Kharkiv. Kiev defied all the expectations of experts and put up impressive resistance. Eventually, this forced the Russian troops to make a temporary retreat. Russia's next goal was to control the Crimean Peninsula, which was illegally taken by Russia in 2014. And to build a bridge between the Russian-backed separatist republics in Luhansk and Donetsk, which emerged after this event. These regions came to be known together as Donbass, and Vladimir Putin now wants to control it. But the freedom struggle of the Ukrainians does not allow this request to the Russian leader. So how did the Ukrainians suddenly seize the advantage in Luhansk? Actually, the answer to this question may surprise you, but we can say that the patriotism and courage of the soldiers in the Ukrainian army, as well as the military aid of the West and the USA, defeated Russia, which has one of the strongest armies in the world. Let's take a look at how this is. The 42-year-old Ukrainian soldier, Oleksandr Matsievsky, who was shot by Russian soldiers and whose last word was victory over Ukraine, was declared a hero by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. This example proved Ukraine's freedom victory in the clearest way and showed that sometimes courage and patriotism preceded heavy and powerful military ammunition. Zelensky awarded Matsievsky to the country's highest medal, the Hero of Ukraine, a man all Ukrainians would know, a brave soldier who will be remembered forever. It is believed that Matsievsky was killed in the city of Bakhmut, where he was serving as a sniper from the northern district of Chernihiv and where violent clashes took place. Makovsky's mother told the German media last week that Matsievsky worked as an electrician in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, before the war. Here is a complete heroic story. This week, the Ukrainian forces, bravely defending their own lands and continuing their war with the Russians with all their might, managed to attract the attention of the EU. The EU took a critical step towards sanctions against those targeting Ukraine's territorial integrity. The European Union has extended sanctions against individuals and organizations targeting Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence for 6 months. In the statement made by the European Council, it was reported that the restrictive measures were extended until September 15, 2023. The sanctions include an asset freeze, a travel ban, and a ban on financial funding for those on the list. Current sanctions cover 1,473 individuals and 205 entities. Most of these individuals and organizations were placed on the sanctions list after Russia launched an attack on Ukraine on February 24, 2022. With sanctions, the EU aims to weaken Russia's economy, cut off its access to critical technologies and markets, and reduce its ability to fight. Taking action after the EU. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stated that he was skeptical of the proposed peace talks with Russia and announced that his country would continue its military support to Ukraine. At the joint press conference with Bhutan, Prime Minister Lotte Tschering in Berlin, Olaf Scholz drew attention to the fact that Russia's war against Ukraine continues and emphasized that Russia has gathered new troops and sent them to the front. The Chancellor stated that under these conditions there could be no talk of negotiations. Scholz stated that they will continue to provide military support to Ukraine and that what they are doing now is aimed at changing the state of the war and making a just peace possible for Ukraine, stressing that Ukraine is ready for peace. But this cannot be dictated, Scholz said. You cannot negotiate when someone puts a gun to your head. But the Russian president still intends to do so. While the surprise support from the European Union and the German Chancellor to the Ukrainians continues to isolate Russia in the world political arena, it seems very difficult for the Russian army, which is losing power day by day, to prepare for the spring attacks and to make an unexpected move. The Ukrainians managed to make a huge surprise to the Russians in the Solder area. After stepping a little bit back from their initial positions in Solder, they drew in a lot of Russian forces that wanted to maintain the momentum and push the Ukrainians as far as possible. However, it turned out that the Ukrainians had a lot of underground passages, and so because the front line shifted westward, the Ukrainians were able to suddenly appear right behind Russian backs and cause a lot of trouble. Yesterday, I told you that the Ukrainian control over the eastern part of Solder was compromised because the Russians established total control over Yakovlevka and started attacking them from the flank. I told you that the Ukrainians retreated from the local school in Bakhmutka towards the warehouses and from the factory now in Solder, around 3 streets back. Today it turned out that the retreat process was incomplete and that the Ukrainians decided to leave warehouses in Bakhmutka as well, despite the fact that the Russians seemingly received an order to cease fire. The Russians tried to take advantage of that and pushed in the direction of Solidar. Interestingly, the Solidar area is mostly the responsibility of the Wagner forces, so it looks like they have some latitude as to how tightly the orders from the Russian Ministry of Defense should be followed. In any case, the latest updates indicate that the fights are taking place in the area of the train station, Decoin Square. The latest updates also suggest that even though the area of Ukrainian control shrank by several kilometers, it does not mean that the Russians have total control over the empty territory. Today, Russian sources confirmed that Russian forces experienced huge problems with moving forward in solidarity. The reason why the Russians can't even start storming the central part of Solidar is that the Ukrainians are using various secret tunnels to get into the Russian rear and sabotage it. As you remember yesterday, I told you that the Ukrainians are fully controlling a salt mine that has an incredibly developed network of underground communication. A lot of caves and tunnels lead to the eastern part of Solidarity, since the eastern part of Solder is behind the contact line. The Russians do not monitor every block that they assume is under their control, so the Ukrainians can deploy in small groups, leave some mines, destroy small ammunition depots and some equipment, and sneak back. The Russians struggle to reveal the entrances to the tunnels, and therefore they cannot move in their equipment closer to the front to maintain their positions. They are permanently. So even though the Ukrainians stabbed back by several kilometers, most of the area that they left is going to remain in the gray zone, creating a valuable buffer in front of the main stronghold in the central part of the city. More news is coming from the southern region. Several days ago, the Ukrainians deployed a small group to the island Veliki Potyomkin and placed a Ukrainian flag. Later, the head of the southern group of forces elaborated that this was basically a signal to the Russians to leave this island as fast as possible. Today, the Russians made a response and started shelling the bridge that connects the Ukrainian-controlled land to the island. Some sources are saying that the Russians are likely using this island to shell Kherson. The Russians reportedly moved in their artillery systems, make a full salvo, and quickly pull back in order to ensure the safety of the city. The Ukrainians are trained to at least put this island in the gray zone. And while nothing suggests that the Ukrainians are conducting active on-the-ground operations today, there were a lot of reports of big explosions along the front line. The explosions were inflicted by the Ukrainian Air Force, which has conducted a series of fire missions with a specific focus on Aliysk and Radunsk. These are quite big settlements located right on the main Russian highway. So there have always been a lot of soldiers stationed in the region. While the Ukrainian General Staff is still gathering information about the results of these strikes, they have published a report about yesterday's strikes. They stated that over the last several days the Ukrainians had identified the areas of concentrations of Russian forces near Tokmak and Gavrilov-Kadruya. As a result of targeting military objects, the Ukrainians have inflicted irretrievable losses of 80 mobilized soldiers in Tokmak and 100 soldiers in Havrilivka. Local news reported that the Russians are seizing the property of the farmers and turning their hangars for equipment into barracks. The Russians suspect that a lot of locals are helping the Ukrainians and linking the targets, and given their attitude towards the locals, it is hardly surprising. The Russians reportedly made the curfew even more strict in separate areas in order to conduct filtration operations by checking everyone's phones. So the weather conditions force the Ukrainians to be very careful with using their devices.